Hey guys, I brought you poison to put you to sleep tonight. Don't be afraid. This poison can't be eaten or smelled. There's no need to worry. You'll wake up before the meeting tomorrow morning. Tonight we're leaving behind the famous battlefields, noisy kings, and dramatic palace conspiracies. No emperors will be dramatically poisoning relatives tonight. No medieval knights are about to fall into suspicious moats. No Roman senators are preparing another spectacular betrayal. Instead, we're climbing aboard an old wooden ship. It's crowded. It smells terrible. Everything is damp. The crew hasn't had a proper bath in weeks. And somewhere below deck, someone is desperately trying to keep a pile of delicate papyrus scrolls from becoming very expensive soup. Because before waterproof paper existed, before plastic containers, before waterproof backpacks, before even simple notebooks, ancient civilizations somehow managed to transport thousands of priceless documents across dangerous seas. And honestly, it worked far better than you'd expect. So dim the lights, settle comfortably, maybe grab a blanket, and let's drift back nearly 3,000 years to discover how sailors protected one of humanity's most fragile inventions while the Mediterranean did its absolute best to destroy it. Imagine you're standing on the docks of ancient Egypt sometime around 700 BCE. The morning sun is already warming the harbor. Workers shout to each other. Donkeys complain loudly about their careers. Merchants argue over prices with a kind of confidence only merchants possess. The air smells like salt water mixed with fish, tar, fresh rope, smoke, and humanity. Ships rock gently against wooden piers. Some are carrying grain. Others transport wine. Some are loaded with timber imported from distant forests. But one vessel carries something worth far more than gold by weight. Information. Not books. Not bound manuscripts. Scrolls. Hundreds of them. Each one carefully rolled. Each one vulnerable. Each one capable of disappearing forever after one careless wave. Today, if your notebook gets wet, you might lose a shopping list. An Egyptian scribe could lose decades of recorded history. That creates rather different levels of workplace anxiety. Papyrus wasn't exactly designed for adventures at sea. It began life as a tall marsh plant growing abundantly along the Nile. Workers harvested thick green stalks. They sliced them into thin strips. Those strips were laid side by side. Another layer crossed over the first. Everything was pressed together under considerable weight. Natural plant sugars acted almost like glue. After drying, polishing, and trimming, the result became one of history's greatest inventions. Light, flexible, easy to write on, remarkably practical, as long as nobody dumped it into seawater, which, unfortunately, was exactly what the sea constantly threatened to do. Salt water is relentless. It seeps into everything. It stains. It warps. It encourages mold. It weakens fibers. A soaked papyrus scroll might dry again, but it would rarely return to its original condition. Ink could smear. Fibers separated. Edges curled. Entire sections simply vanished. Imagine spending 6 months copying an important religious text by hand, only for Poseidon to decide he'd prefer reading it himself. Ancient sailors understood this danger remarkably well. Many crew members couldn't even read, yet they fully appreciated that certain cargo required extraordinary care, because somebody important had usually paid enormous sums for it. And upsetting wealthy temple officials was generally considered unhealthy. The ancient Mediterranean wasn't merely a highway. It was unpredictable. Storms appeared suddenly. Winds shifted without warning. Even experienced captains respected the sea. Sometimes, Respect wasn't enough. Ancient ships weren't gigantic. Most merchant vessels relied heavily on sail power. Cargo occupied every available space. Barrels, amphorae, ropes, food, fresh water, tools, animals occasionally, passengers sometimes. Everything had to fit. Everything had to survive. And somehow, so did the scrolls. Fortunately, ancient civilizations developed surprisingly clever methods. The first line of defense was location. Location mattered almost more than any container. Experienced sailors knew which parts of the ship collected water first. Lower holds often flooded. Deck cargo suffered spray. Bow compartments took heavy impacts during rough seas. Instead, valuable documents usually occupied elevated interior storage spaces whenever possible, closer to the sender, away from leaking seams, protected by surrounding cargo. Think of it as ancient risk management. Not perfect, but sensible. Heavy grain sacks often formed protective barriers. Large baskets cushioned delicate goods. Wooden partitions reduced shifting. The goal wasn't luxury. It was survival. Because during storms, everything moved. Imagine placing your laptop inside a washing machine filled with furniture. That begins to approximate ancient cargo transport. Ships twisted. Wood creaked. Barrels rolled. Crates slammed together. Ropes snapped tight. Sailors shouted constantly over roaring wind. Meanwhile, some poor merchant worried about his scroll collection. Storage containers themselves became equally important. Papyrus rarely traveled alone. Instead, scrolls were grouped carefully, wrapped individually in linen cloth, sometimes tied with cords, then placed inside cylindrical containers. Some were made of wood. Others used woven reeds. The wealthiest owners commissioned beautifully crafted cases. These weren't decorative luxuries. They were survival equipment. Layers mattered. One protective barrier wasn't enough. Linen absorbed minor moisture. Outer containers blocked splashes. Interior wrapping reduced abrasion. Everything worked together, rather like dressing for heavy rain. One coat helps. Several layers help much more. Ancient Egyptians already possessed extensive experience preserving delicate objects. After all, this was the civilization that famously specialized in making things last thousands of years. Mummies receive most of the attention. Poor papyrus rarely enjoys similar celebrity. Yet preserving documents required astonishing skill. Temple archives accumulated enormous collections. Government offices maintained records, tax lists, legal agreements, military reports, religious ceremonies, medical knowledge, astronomical observations, trade contracts. Without preserved documents, entire governments became considerably more forgetful. Imagine trying to collect taxes after losing everyone's paperwork. Actually, perhaps some taxpayers would have welcomed that particular storm. Merchants transporting scrolls understood their value perfectly. Some shipments represented years of labor. Others contained unique religious texts impossible to replace. Many documents existed as single copies. There were no backup hard drives, no cloud storage, no convenient undo button. If a scroll disappeared overboard, history simply became smaller. Ancient captains therefore treated documentary cargo differently from ordinary merchandise. Not because paper weighed much, because knowledge did. One fascinating technique involved waxed linen coverings. While not completely waterproof, wax-treated cloth dramatically slowed water penetration. Beeswax had long served multiple purposes across ancient societies: sealants, lighting, medicine, protection. Applying wax to textiles created surprisingly effective moisture resistance, enough at least to survive brief exposure. Long storms remained dangerous. Short encounters became manageable. Some containers also featured tightly fitted lids. Again, not watertight, but significantly better than leaving priceless manuscripts exposed to sea spray. Small improvements accumulated. Every extra minute before water reached the papyrus increased survival odds. Ancient sailors excelled at practical engineering, not theoretical perfection. Good enough often meant everything. A merchant ship has finally slipped away from the busy harbor. The shoreline is shrinking. The shouting dockworkers have become tiny figures waving from the pier. Soon, even the grand temples disappear into a shimmering haze. Now it's just the ship, the sea, the sky, and several hundred papyrus scrolls that everyone hopes will still exist by the end of the journey. At first, life aboard feels surprisingly peaceful. The Mediterranean has a reputation today as a pleasant vacation destination. Ancient sailors would probably find that description hilarious. To them, the Mediterranean was less of a relaxing holiday spot and more like a neighbor who smiled politely one minute and threw flower pots through your window the next. The sea was beautiful. The sea was generous. The sea was also deeply unpredictable. The captain knew this better than anyone. He had crossed these waters dozens of times. He knew where sudden winds liked to appear. He knew which islands created dangerous currents. He knew that clouds gathering on the horizon were never just interesting scenery. He also knew exactly where the scrolls had been stored, not because he planned to read them. There wasn't time for leisurely literature while trying to keep a merchant ship afloat, but because expensive cargo demanded attention. Below deck, the scrolls rested inside sturdy wooden chests. The chests themselves were masterpieces of practical thinking. They weren't fancy palace furniture covered in gold leaf. They didn't need carved lions or elegant ivory decorations. Their job was wonderfully simple. Keep the outside. The wood chosen for these containers mattered. Egypt imported cedar from the forests of the Levant whenever possible. Cedar resisted insects. It smelled pleasant. More importantly, it tolerated moisture far better than many softer woods. Other local timbers found their way into cargo boxes as well, depending on availability and cost. Not every merchant could afford imported cedar. History, as always, had different price tiers. Even priceless knowledge occasionally had to travel economy class. Inside each chest, the scrolls were arranged carefully rather than stacked carelessly. Modern librarians would probably approve. Large scrolls rested along one side. Smaller bundles occupied another. Frequently consulted documents remained closer to the top. Rare texts stayed wrapped more securely near the center. The goal wasn't simply organization. It was minimizing movement. Because every roll, bump, and collision slowly damaged fragile papyrus. Imagine placing 100 delicate drinking straws inside a barrel. Now shake the barrel continuously for 10 days. That's roughly what an ancient voyage felt like. The less the scrolls shifted, the longer they survived. Soft linen padding filled empty spaces. Sometimes old cloth served this purpose. Sometimes woven reeds. Sometimes even spare rope carefully coiled to reduce sudden impacts. Nothing aboard a merchant vessel went to waste. A torn sail might become packing material. An old tunic could protect valuable cargo. Ancient recycling wasn't fashionable. It was simply sensible. Then came another challenge: humidity. Even without rain, even without waves crashing aboard, the sea itself constantly filled the air with moisture. Wood absorbed it. Cloth absorbed it. Papyrus absorbed it. Ancient scribes knew damp air was almost as dangerous as standing water. Over time, moisture encouraged mold. Ink could fade. Fibers softened. Scrolls became weaker each passing week. Ventilation, therefore, became surprisingly important. When weather allowed, sailors opened storage spaces briefly. Fresh air circulated below deck. Not for comfort. Certainly not. The hold still smelled like wet rope, fish, tar, onions, sweating sailors, and possibly one very nervous goat. Fresh air simply reduced trapped moisture. Sometimes that's the difference between preservation and slow decay. Ships themselves weren't perfectly sealed. Far from it. Ancient hulls leaked. All of them. Some leaked only a little. Others behaved more like determined sieves. Crews accepted this reality. They carried buckets. Lots of buckets. Men worked pumps. Others baled water by hand. Hour after hour. Day after day. Imagine your workplace requiring constant removal of seawater just to remain operational. It was exhausting, but completely normal. While sailors fought incoming water, merchants occasionally checked valuable cargo whenever conditions permitted. Not obsessively. Opening protective containers too often defeated their purpose. Still, inspections mattered. Better to discover slight dampness early than discover an entire chest transformed into expensive papier-mâché. One merchant might gently untie a linen wrapping. He'd inspect the outer layers, feel for moisture, look for stains, check whether wax coatings remained intact. If everything looked satisfactory, the bundle went back exactly as before. Ancient quality control, performed while standing aboard a gently rocking wooden ship. No pressure. Of course, the sea eventually became bored with everyone's confidence. Clouds gathered. Dark ones. Not the pleasant fluffy clouds painters enjoy adding to peaceful landscapes. These clouds meant business. The captain noticed first. He always noticed first. His eyes lingered on the western horizon. The wind changed direction. Not dramatically. Just enough. Experienced sailors exchanged quick glances. Nobody smiled. Orders spread across the deck. Sails were adjusted. Loose equipment secured. Extra ropes tightened. Crew members moved with calm efficiency born from repetition. Panic accomplished nothing. Preparation accomplished everything. Below deck, another crewman checked the cargo. Heavy amphory received additional wedges to prevent rolling. Grain sacks were lashed together. Wooden chests containing the scrolls were tied firmly against support beams. This step was crucial. A waterproof chest tumbling across the hold could still split open. Protection meant very little after colliding repeatedly with stone jars full of olive oil. Outside, the first drops of rain arrived. Slowly, almost politely, as though the storm wished to introduce itself before becoming thoroughly unpleasant. The captain wasn't fooled. Within minutes, the wind strengthened. Sails cracked loudly overhead. Rigging began singing that eerie humming sound sailors had respected for centuries. The ship rolled harder. Waves slapped the hull. Not yet dangerous. Just persuasive. Then came the first truly large wave. It crashed across the bow. Water rushed over the deck. Crew members grabbed ropes instinctively. One unlucky sailor lost a sandal. History rarely records these tiny tragedies. Yet somewhere beneath all the stories of kings and conquerors lies a lonely sandal resting forever on the Mediterranean seabed. The storm intensified. Rain poured sideways. Visibility shrank. The coastline disappeared completely. Everything became gray water and darker sky. The ship climbed steep waves, then slid heavily into deep troughs. Each impact made the hull groan. Wood flexed. Joints creaked. Tarred seams strained against relentless pressure. Below deck, tiny streams of water began appearing. Nothing dramatic. No giant holes. Just countless little leaks finding their way through the aging hull. Buckets appeared immediately. Crewmen bailed continuously. Water splashed across the floor. Fortunately, the scroll chests had never been placed directly on those floors. They rested on wooden supports, raised several inches above the planks. Such a small detail. Such an enormous difference. Because the first water collecting below deck remained underneath them, ancient merchants understood a simple truth. Water always seeks the lowest place, so don't put priceless documents there. Sometimes the smartest engineering solution is simply refusing to argue with gravity. The storm raged through the afternoon. Waves continued hammering the vessel. Spray forced itself through every tiny opening. The crew grew soaked, cold, exhausted, yet the cargo remained secure. Mostly because countless generations of sailors had already learned these lessons through painful experience. Every rope placement, every raised platform, every wax-coated cloth, every carefully fitted lid, all existed because someone somewhere had once failed to protect valuable cargo. History is an excellent teacher. Its tuition fees are simply outrageous. As darkness slowly settled over the sea, the worst of the storm finally began passing. The waves remained large, but their rhythm softened. Rain eased into scattered showers. Clouds slowly drifted apart. One by one, weary sailors looked upward. Stars appeared between the clouds. Not many, just enough. Enough to navigate. Enough to breathe again. Enough to wonder whether the scrolls had survived. Tomorrow morning, the cargo chest would be opened, the linen wrappings examined, the papyrus carefully unrolled just enough to ensure the ink still clung to the fibers. Knowledge had survived another encounter with the Mediterranean, not through luck, but through planning, craftsmanship, patience, and generations of accumulated experience passed from sailor to sailor. And perhaps, just perhaps, a little quiet mercy from the sea itself. Morning arrives quietly, not with dramatic trumpets, not with heroic speeches, just the gentle creaking of timber and the tired sighs of sailors who are grateful the ship is still floating. After yesterday's storm, even the waves seem exhausted. The sea has one of history's most peculiar personalities. It can spend an entire day trying to sink you, then greet you the following morning as if nothing unusual happened. Oh, that little hurricane. Water under the bridge. Or rather, water everywhere. The crew begins its daily routine. Buckets empty the last pools of seawater from the deck. Loose ropes are coiled again. The cook somehow produces breakfast from ingredients that spent half the night trying to escape their storage baskets. No one complains too loudly. After surviving a storm, almost any meal tastes acceptable. Even the bread, especially if it isn't wet. Below deck, however, another ritual is about to begin. One far quieter than trimming sails. One far more delicate. The inspection of the scrolls. The merchant responsible for the documents kneels beside the largest wooden chest. His movements are slow, not because he's tired, because rushing around priceless manuscripts is generally considered an unwise career decision. He unties the leather cord securing the lid. The hinges creak softly. Inside, The linen bundles appear exactly as they were packed days earlier. Promising sign. He lifts the first bundle carefully. The cloth feels dry. Another good sign. No strange smell. No obvious staining. No mold beginning to appear. Ancient merchants trusted their noses almost as much as their eyes. Damp papyrus developed a distinctive odor. Anyone who worked with scrolls regularly recognized it immediately. Thankfully, the scent is mostly linen, cedar, and beeswax. A successful combination. One by one, the bundles emerge. Some contain legal contracts. Others carry merchant accounts. One might preserve temple records. Another perhaps contains copies of famous poems. Not every scroll held thrilling secrets. Many were gloriously ordinary. Receipts, inventories, lists, endless lists. History often survives because someone was exceptionally committed to paperwork. Entire civilizations become easier to understand thanks to accounts. It's not glamorous, but it's incredibly useful. The merchant selects one scroll for closer examination. Slowly, he loosens its linen wrapping. Underneath lies another protective layer. Thin leather. Soft with age. Still flexible. Still remarkably effective. Leather was one of the ancient world's quiet heroes. Unlike papyrus, properly treated leather tolerated moisture surprisingly well. Not perfectly. Nothing aboard a wooden ship truly escaped the sea. But leather created another valuable barrier. Each additional layer bought precious time. If seawater reached the leather, it still had to pass through it. Then through linen. Only afterward could it threaten the papyrus itself. Time. That was the real treasure. Even a few extra minutes could allow sailors to rescue valuable cargo before serious damage occurred. The scroll itself remains tightly rolled. A simple cord keeps it secure. Loose scrolls suffer. Their edges bend. Corners tear. Dust settles between fibers. Keeping them tightly rolled protected the writing surface from unnecessary exposure. Modern books rest flat on shelves. Ancient scrolls preferred living in comfortable little cylinders. A much less dramatic shape. A much more practical one. The merchant gently opens only the first few inches. Never more than necessary. Repeatedly unrolling an entire scroll placed stress on the fibers. Imagine folding and unfolding the same piece of paper hundreds of times. Eventually, something gives. Papyrus behaved similarly. Careful handling extended its life enormously. The ink appears sharp. Black characters stand confidently across the pale surface. Mission accomplished. The scroll returns to its wrapping. Another successful voyage. At least so far. This careful packing didn't begin aboard the ship. It started days earlier in the workshops of professional scribes. These men, and occasionally women in certain periods, understood their materials intimately. Creating a scroll meant much more than writing beautiful symbols. Preparation mattered just as much. Fresh papyrus sheets first required careful polishing. Smooth stones rubbed gently across the surface. This flattened rough fibers. A smoother sheet accepted ink more evenly. Less snagging. Cleaner writing. Better durability. Think of sanding wood before painting. The extra effort paid dividends later. Then came the ink. Ancient Egyptian black ink usually relied upon carbon. Soot collected from oil lamps. Finely ground charcoal. Sometimes mixed with gum from acacia trees. Water completed the recipe. Simple ingredients. Remarkably durable results. Thousands of years later, archaeologists can still read many of these texts. Modern office printers sometimes struggle after 5 years. History can be wonderfully humbling. Red ink served another purpose. Made from ochre rich in iron oxide, it highlighted titles, warnings, important names, or religious instructions. Ancient readers immediately recognized its significance. Even thousands of years before traffic lights, people already understood that red usually meant pay attention. Once writing finished, the scroll wasn't immediately packed away. First, the ink needed time to dry completely. Humidity complicated this process. Too much moisture trapped inside a rolled manuscript invited future trouble. Patient scribes waited, then waited a little longer. Rushing the final stages risked ruining weeks of work. Patience may not sound exciting. Neither does preserving civilization. Yet somehow the two often arrived together. Only after complete drying did scribes polish the surface again. Very gently. This removed loose particles, smoothed tiny imperfections. Sometimes it even gave the finished scroll a subtle sheen. Not for decoration, for function. A smoother surface resisted dirt slightly better. Small improvements accumulated, just like aboard the ship. Next came identification. Imagine owning hundreds of nearly identical rolled scrolls. Without labels, finding the correct one would become a nightmare. Ancient librarians solved this elegantly. Small tags, called syllaboi by the Greeks centuries later, could identify a scroll's contents. In Egypt, chords or exterior notes often served similar purposes. The label remained visible while the scroll stayed rolled. No need to unroll 50 documents just to locate one tax record. Efficiency has always been fashionable among librarians, even if no one else noticed. Storage before shipment resembled storage aboard ship. Scrolls preferred dry rooms, raised shelves, wooden cabinets. Stone buildings helped moderate temperature. Direct sunlight remained the enemy. So did insects. Papyrus, unfortunately, appealed to tiny creatures looking for lunch. Ancient storekeepers fought a constant battle against beetles, worms, and rodents. Cats earned their keep admirably. One determined mouse could accomplish more destruction in a night than a careless apprentice in a week. Sometimes both work together. History can be cruelly collaborative. Before departure, merchants prepared detailed inventories. Every scroll counted. Every bundle recorded. Not because bureaucracy is inevitable, although history strongly suggests it is, but because valuable cargo demanded accountability. If 12 scrolls left Egypt, 12 should arrive, preferably the same 12. If one disappeared, uncomfortable conversations followed. Very uncomfortable. Captains disliked missing cargo. Merchants disliked missing profits. Temple officials disliked missing sacred texts. Everyone, in their own way, disliked paperwork that no longer existed. Wax seals often secured the cords around particularly important scrolls or storage chests. A blob of warm beeswax received the impression of a carved seal. Once hardened, it revealed whether anyone had tampered with the package. A broken seal didn't necessarily mean theft. It might simply indicate inspection, or rough handling, or an exceptionally curious sailor. Still, questions would certainly follow. Ancient security systems rarely relied on complicated locks. They relied on evidence. Someone always knew if something had been opened. It's surprisingly effective when reputations matter. As the merchant finishes examining the last bundle, he smiles quietly. No applause. No celebration. Just relief. Another storm weathered. Another shipment preserved. The scrolls are wrapped once more. Leather inside. Linen outside. Back into their cedar chest. The lid closes with a satisfying thump. Outside, The sailors raise fresh sailcloth as a favorable wind returns. The voyage continues. More islands wait ahead, more ports, more markets, and, almost certainly, more opportunities for the Mediterranean to remind everyone that it remains thoroughly unconvinced by human travel schedules. For now, though, knowledge is safe, protected not by miracles, but by craftsmanship, preparation, careful habits, and countless ordinary people whose names history rarely remembered. Ironically, thanks to their work, history remembered almost everyone else. The sea is calm again, almost suspiciously calm. After several days aboard an ancient merchant ship, the crew has learned not to trust calm weather too much. The Mediterranean has an unfortunate habit of behaving like someone who says, "Don't worry, everything's fine," moments before knocking over an entire table. Still, today appears genuinely peaceful. The sun rises behind a thin curtain of pale clouds. The wind is steady. The sails fill nicely. Even the ship itself seems relieved. It groans less. It sways gently instead of lurching like an overworked donkey trying to climb a mountain. Far ahead, a dark line slowly appears on the horizon. Land. The sailors notice it before anyone else. One points quietly. Another adjusts his gaze. The captain nods without much excitement. Experienced captains rarely celebrated too early. You weren't safely in port until the anchor rested on the seabed. Many ships had discovered that lesson the unpleasant way. As the hours pass, the coastline grows clearer. Rocky cliffs, low hills, clusters of white buildings, wooden docks stretching into the harbor, fishing boats moving lazily through the morning light. The smell changes before the scenery does. The clean salt air begins mixing with smoke from cooking fires. Fresh bread, olive oil, pitch bubbling in repair yards, fish drying in the sun, livestock that had very strong opinions about being transported. Ancient ports were loud, very loud. Hundreds of voices blended together. Merchants shouted prices. Dockworkers called for more rope. Children ran between carts. Blacksmiths hammered iron. Carpenters repaired hulls. Somewhere, someone argued passionately about taxes. Human civilization, it seems, has always found taxation to be an excellent conversation starter. As the merchant vessel glides toward the harbor entrance, harbor officials prepare to receive it. Contrary to popular imagination, ancient ports weren't places where anyone simply wandered in, unloaded cargo, and hoped for the best. Important goods were documented, fees collected, cargo inspected, especially valuable cargo, especially written documents. Knowledge represented power. Power usually attracted paperwork. The anchor splashes into the water. Heavy rope slides through weather hands. The ship settles gently into place. Only now does the captain finally allow himself a long breath. The voyage isn't completely over, but the sea has surrendered for today. Soon, narrow wooden gangplanks connect ship and dock. The unloading begins. This process is surprisingly organized. Heavy cargo leaves first. Large amphorae filled with wine requires several men. Grain sacks follow. Timber beams, stone weights, bundles of textiles. Everything moves slowly. Nobody wants to drop expensive merchandise into the harbor, although it certainly happened. Ancient harbors contain countless objects resting peacefully beneath layers of mud. Broken jars, lost anchors, coins, tools, and somewhere the sandal our unfortunate sailors sacrificed during the storm. Archaeologists remain eternally grateful for human clumsiness. Eventually, attention turns toward the cedar chest. Unlike grain sacks, nobody grabs it carelessly. Two experienced handlers lift it together. Another man walks ahead, clearing a path through the busy dock. The merchant follows closely behind, not because he doubts the workers, because those scrolls may represent years of investment. One careless stumble could erase fortunes. The chest reaches a nearby warehouse. Compared with the bustling dock outside, the interior feels wonderfully quiet. Cool stone walls soften the summer heat. Small windows admit only limited sunlight. Dust floats lazily through narrow beams of light. This is exactly the sort of place fragile Papyrus appreciates. Dry, cool, calm. Inside waits another specialist. Not a sailor. Not a merchant. An inspector. His job is wonderfully boring, which makes him absolutely essential. He examines incoming manuscripts before they join local collections or continue onward to buyers. He begins with the chest itself. Any obvious signs of water damage? Warped wood? Broken hinges? Cracked wax seals? Everything tells a story. The merchant breaks the seal. The lid opens. A faint scent of cedar escapes, along with beeswax, linen, and very old plant fibers. To anyone else, it might smell like a cupboard. To this inspector, it smells like successful preservation. One bundle emerges. The linen remains neatly folded. No stains. No discoloration. Excellent. He unties the wrapping. Not hurriedly. Never hurriedly. Ancient librarians understood something modern archivists still believe. The faster you move around fragile documents, the sooner they become even more fragile. The leather wrapping beneath receives equal attention. Its surface shows a few tiny salt crystals, evidence of humid air during the voyage. Nothing alarming. The leather did exactly what it was supposed to do. It absorbed moisture before the papyrus ever had to. Sometimes, success leaves almost invisible traces. The scroll itself finally appears, still tightly rolled, still secured with its cord. The inspector gently touches the outer layers, not squeezing, simply feeling. Experienced fingers detect subtle differences impossible to describe fully. Dry papyrus feels crisp, healthy, slightly springy. Damp papyrus feels heavier, cooler, almost reluctant. Centuries of practice had trained specialists to notice these tiny changes. No complicated instruments, just remarkable experience. He slowly unrolls the first section. The fibers lie flat. The ink remains dark. No fuzzy patches. No spreading stains. No curling edges. Another success. The merchant smiles again. He's becoming rather fond of successful inspections. If only every business meeting ended this pleasantly. Some scrolls require extra attention, not because they're damaged, because they're unusually important. Religious texts often receive especially careful examination. Government records too. Legal contracts, royal correspondence, scientific observations, medical writings. Imagine discovering the only copy of important surgical text had quietly grown mold halfway across the Mediterranean. That would certainly complicate future healthcare. Fortunately, ancient conservators had methods for dealing with minor problems. If a scroll contained slight moisture, but no visible damage, it wasn't immediately shelved. Instead, it rested in a carefully prepared drying room. Not outside in direct sunlight. That would dry it too quickly. Rapid drying encouraged warping. Fibers shrank unevenly. Cracks developed. Patience remained the preferred treatment. Always patience. Scrolls rested upon smooth wooden boards. Sometimes fine linen separated the papyrus from the surface. Air circulated naturally. Windows open during dry weather, closed when humidity increased. No roaring fires. No frantic attempts to hurry nature. Good preservation rarely enjoys being rushed. Meanwhile, scribes recorded the arrival. Another inventory. Another list. History truly adored lists. Date of arrival. Origin. Owner. Number of scrolls. General condition. Seal impressions. Storage location. Every detail entered carefully onto fresh papyrus. One shipment helping preserve another. There's something wonderfully circular about that. The warehouse itself resembles a miniature library. Shelves line the walls. Clay jars occupy corners. Wooden cabinets protect older manuscripts. Bundles rest horizontally. Others stand upright inside cylindrical containers. Everything has its place. Chaos may entertain storytellers. Archivists generally prefer labels. Somewhere nearby, apprentices watch quietly. They're learning, not through grand speeches, but through observation. How firmly should a scroll be held? How slowly should it unroll? How does healthy papyrus sound? Yes, sound. A dry, well-preserved scroll makes a faint whisper as it opens. A damp one moves differently. Tiny details, remarkably important. These apprentices may one day supervise libraries themselves. Knowledge survives because each generation teaches the next, not only what to preserve, but how. Outside, life in the harbor continues without interruption. Ships arrive. Ships depart. Merchants bargain loudly. Dock workers complain cheerfully. Children chase stray dogs between stacked cargo. The world keeps moving. Inside the warehouse, however, time feels slower, quieter, almost respectful. Every scroll resting on those shelves carries voices from another place, another city, another generation. Some contain laws, others poems, others prayers whispered centuries ago. Some preserve ordinary business accounts. One records a shipment of barley. Another lists wages. A third documents repairs to a temple roof. None seem especially dramatic. Yet together, they form civilization. History isn't built entirely from famous battles. It's built from ordinary mornings, routine inspections, careful handwriting, patient craftsmen, responsible sailors, anonymous workers doing their jobs astonishingly well. Without them, there would be far fewer stories to tell. As evening settles across the harbor, the newly arrived scrolls finally take their places among hundreds already resting safely inside the warehouse. They have survived wind, salt, rain, rolling seas, leaking hulls, and long weeks aboard a wooden ship. Tomorrow they may continue their journey, or perhaps remain here permanently. Either way, they've reached dry land. For fragile papyrus, there are few happier endings to be. Why now? Our little collection of scrolls has made it safely across the Mediterranean. The sailors are pleased. The merchant is even more pleased. The harbor inspector is quietly satisfied, which, for someone whose profession revolves around finding problems, is probably the closest thing to enthusiasm. But the scroll's journey isn't actually over. In many ways, the real work begins now. Because preserving knowledge wasn't simply about surviving the voyage. It was about surviving the years afterward. Sometimes, the centuries afterward. If you've ever imagined an ancient library as a peaceful room filled with endless shelves where wise scholars quietly read all day, you're only partly correct. There certainly were scholars. There certainly were shelves. There is also dust, insects, Humidity, mice, occasional roof leaks, the constant threat of fire, and apprentices who occasionally drop things. Libraries, it turns out, have always been managed by people. People, wonderful though they are, have an impressive talent for creating new problems. Fortunately, they also became remarkably skilled at solving them. Just beyond the storage rooms lies a quieter workshop. Unlike the bustling harbor outside, very little noise enters here. A wooden table stretches across the center of the room. Sunlight filters through narrow windows, softened by linen curtains. The light is bright enough to work. Not so bright that it damages delicate papyrus. Even sunlight had to be treated with suspicion. Too much of it slowly weakened fibers. It faded ink. It dried materials unevenly. Ancient conservators couldn't explain ultraviolet radiation. They simply noticed that documents left in harsh sunlight aged faster. Sometimes observation beats theory. Waiting at one of the tables is a craftsman. He isn't famous. History almost certainly forgot his name. No statues celebrate him. No poems praise his careful hands. And yet, without people like him, countless ancient texts would never have survived long enough for anyone else to become famous. His tools are wonderfully ordinary. A smooth polishing stone, a small bronze knife, soft linen cloths, thin wooden boards, natural glue stored in tiny ceramic containers, several carefully cut strips of fresh papyrus. Nothing looks particularly impressive. Neither does a modern surgeon's scalpel. It's the skill behind the tools that matters. Today, one of yesterday's arrivals requires attention. Not because the storm nearly destroyed it. Quite the opposite. The protection worked. But one outer edge shows signs of wear from years of handling. The fibers have begun separating. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that demands panic. Just the sort of tiny problem that becomes a very large problem if ignored. Ancient conservators understood something every homeowner eventually learns. Small repairs are usually cheaper than rebuilding everything later. The craftsman gently unrolls the damaged section. Small polished stones hold the scroll flat without placing unnecessary pressure on the writing. No heavy weights. No sudden movements. Patience remains the most important tool in the workshop. He studies the damaged edge. Individual fibers have loosened. Some are lifting slightly. Fortunately, the writing itself remains untouched. That changes everything. Repairing blank margins is much easier than repairing text. Once ink disappears, no amount of craftsmanship can magically recreate forgotten words. History occasionally leaves frustrating blank spaces. The craftsman prepares a tiny amount of adhesive, not modern glue, nothing synthetic. Instead, natural gums collected from local trees, sometimes starch-based pastes, sometimes mixtures carefully refined through generations of experience. The recipes varied from region to region. Each workshop developed its own traditions, rather like family cooking. Except the goal wasn't delicious bread. It was preventing civilization from quietly falling apart. Using a fine reed tool, he applies the adhesive sparingly. Very sparingly. Too much moisture causes its own problems. Too little accomplishes nothing. Finding the balance required years of practice. A narrow strip of matching papyrus is carefully placed beneath the weakened edge. The repair remains almost invisible. Not hidden. Simply respectful. The new material supports the old without pretending to replace it. Modern conservators still admire this philosophy. Preserve. Support. Do not overwhelm. Once the repair is complete, the scroll rests beneath a smooth wooden board, not crushed, simply encouraged to remain flat while the adhesive dries. Again, nothing happens quickly. The workshop operates on the pace of careful thought. Outside, merchants hurry through markets. Ships prepare to sail. Politicians argue. Kings make ambitious plans. Inside this room, a man waits patiently for glue to dry. Oddly enough, his work may outlast all of them. Not every enemy carried a sword. Some had 6 legs. Libraries attracted insects with astonishing enthusiasm. Papyrus originated from plants. Leather came from animals. Linen from flax. Wooden shelves from trees. To countless tiny creatures, libraries looked less like centers of learning and more like remarkably organized buffets. Beetles bored into wood. Silverfish nibbled at fibers. Tiny worms found unexpected homes inside neglected bundles. Rodents occasionally joined the feast. Ancient librarians fought back with determination. Cleanliness became their greatest weapon. Floors swept daily. Dust removed regularly. Storage rooms inspected constantly. Damaged materials isolated before pests spread further. Nothing glamorous, just relentless maintenance. Some aromatic plants were stored nearby as well. Cedar itself discouraged certain insects. Bundles of herbs occasionally helped repel unwanted visitors. Whether every traditional remedy worked exactly as intended is difficult to know. But ancient peoples certainly believed strongly in keeping libraries smelling pleasantly of wood and herbs rather than mold and mice. Speaking of mold, few things frighten conservators more. Unlike insects, mold often arrived quietly. Invisible moisture settled inside tightly packed scrolls. Days passed, then weeks. Only gradually did tiny pale patches appear. By then, the problem could spread rapidly. The first sign wasn't always visible. Sometimes it was smell, a faint earthy odor, slightly sour. Experienced librarians stopped immediately when they noticed it. Every neighboring scroll received inspection. Storage conditions changed. Airflow increased. The affected manuscript moved into isolation. Today we'd call it preventive conservation. 2,000 years ago, they simply called it common sense. The workshop also repaired quartz. People rarely think about the humble string wrapped around an ancient scroll. Yet broken cords created endless headaches. Loose scrolls gradually unrolled. Edges bent. Dust settled between layers. Replacing worn cords prevented much larger problems later. Sometimes the simplest objects quietly perform the most important jobs. The same could be said of labels. Imagine a library containing several thousand nearly identical scrolls. Without labels, finding one specific tax document would become an adventure lasting several afternoons. Ancient librarians therefore replaced faded tags whenever necessary. A fresh label might outlive several generations of readers. No dramatic heroics, just another quiet victory against disorder. Afternoons in the workshop settled into an almost meditative rhythm. Inspect, clean, repair, wrap, record, repeat, hour after hour, day after day. The work demanded concentration without excitement. Perhaps that's why it suited certain personalities so well. Not everyone dreams of commanding armies. Some people simply enjoy putting things back together. History owes them an enormous debt. Occasionally, visitors arrived. Merchants checking valuable shipments. Temple officials requesting sacred texts. Government scribes delivering fresh records. They watched respectfully. Most understood they were witnessing skilled craftsmanship. A repaired scroll represented more than paper. It represented memory itself. Without memory, Empires forget. Religions lose traditions. Families lose histories. Cities lose identities. Knowledge, fragile though it seemed, held entire civilizations together. As evening approached, today's repaired scroll finally left the workbench. The adhesive had dried perfectly. The edge lay flat once again. The writing remained untouched. Fresh linen wrapped around it carefully. The leather covering followed. Finally, the scroll returned to its cedar chest alongside dozens of companions. It looked almost exactly as it had that morning, which was precisely the point. The finest repairs were often the least noticeable. The craftsman cleaned his tools, folded the linen cloths, covered the remaining adhesive, then quietly closed the workshop for the day. No applause greeted him. No crowds gathered outside. Tomorrow, another scroll would arrive. Another tiny tear. Another faded label. Another loose cord. Another chance to help knowledge survive just a little longer. And somehow, across centuries, those countless ordinary days added up to something extraordinary. Because every manuscript that survives into our own time has passed through hands like these. Steady hands, patient hands, hands that understood the greatest victories in history aren't always won with swords. Sometimes, they're won with a tiny brush, a strip of papyrus, and the willingness to spend an entire afternoon repairing the corner of a scroll. Be why now, our scroll has survived marshes along the Nile. The careful hands of papyrus makers, the patient work of scribes, the damp hold of a merchant ship, a Mediterranean storm that seemed personally offended by written documents, a cautious harbor inspection, and the quiet workshop of a conservator whose greatest excitement this week was probably discovering a loose cord. Not exactly the glamorous life promised to works of literature, but survival rarely is glamorous. Today, our journey takes us somewhere that ancient scholars considered almost magical, a place where thousands upon thousands of scrolls rested together, a place where sailors, merchants, kings, priests, mathematicians, doctors, astronomers, poets, philosophers, and government officials all contributed, knowingly or not, to one enormous collection of human memory. A library. Not the kind with cozy armchairs and little signs asking everyone to silence their phones. Ancient visitors had a much easier time. They didn't have phones. They did, however, have sandals. And sandals tracked in just as much dust. As the morning sun rises above the city, the library slowly comes to life. Its doors open before the streets become crowded. Servants sweep stone floors. Apprentices dust wooden cabinets. Senior librarians unlock storage rooms that remain sealed overnight. The building itself feels wonderfully cool compared to the warm streets outside. Thick stone walls keep the worst of the summer heat away. Narrow windows admit enough daylight for reading while avoiding harsh direct sunlight. Everything about the architecture serves one purpose: protect the scrolls. People often imagine ancient libraries as enormous open halls lined from floor to ceiling with endless shelves. Reality was somewhat more practical. Collections were divided carefully. Some scrolls rested inside wooden cupboards. Others occupied shelves built into stone walls. The most valuable manuscripts often remained inside dedicated storage rooms where temperature and humidity changed more slowly. Not because the ancients understood climate control in the modern scientific sense, but because generations of observation had taught them where scrolls aged most gracefully. Certain rooms simply worked better. Experience became architecture. Our newly arrived scroll waits inside its cedar chest until a librarian calls for it. Nearby stands an apprentice carrying a wax writing tablet. Not papyrus. Wax. Ironically, many daily notes never reach papyrus at all. Wax tablets could be erased and reused countless times. Perfect for temporary records, shopping lists, rough drafts, inventory notes. Ancient office workers appreciated reusable stationery just as much as modern accountants appreciate spreadsheets, perhaps slightly more. The librarian removes the scroll carefully. He studies its exterior label. The handwriting identifies the work, its place of origin, sometimes even the name of the scribe. These little details matter enormously. Without them, later generations might confuse one text with another. History already contains enough mysteries. There's no reason to create additional ones accidentally. The apprentice copies this information onto his wax tablet. Slowly, carefully. One mistake here could send a scroll to entirely the wrong shelf. Imagine searching for a medical text only to discover someone had filed it among poetry. Admittedly, some ancient poetry was dramatic enough to sound medically concerning. Still, organization remained preferable. Once recorded, the scroll receives its permanent location. Libraries developed systems long before modern classification numbers existed. Subjects stayed together whenever possible. Religious texts, government records, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, literature, geography, philosophy. Practical knowledge often sat beside theoretical ideas. One cabinet might contain farming advice, another discussions about the movement of stars, both equally important. After all, people need food before they can spend evenings debating the universe. The librarian walks slowly through the storage hall. Rows of cabinets stretch ahead. Some are nearly full. Others leave room for future arrivals. Each cabinet carries small identifying marks. Nothing flashy. Simple symbols. Simple labels. Simple systems usually survive longest. Complicated systems require complicated explanations, and someone eventually loses those explanations. Our scroll finally reaches its shelf. It joins dozens of companions, some older, some newer, some copied only months ago, others already centuries old. Together they rest quietly in the dim light. If scrolls possessed personalities, this might feel like moving into a very scholarly neighborhood. The medical scroll lives beside another medical scroll. The legal document greets several tax records. The poetry collection quietly ignores everyone. Poets, after all, often prefer dramatic solitude, even in storage. Yet storing knowledge represented only half the library's purpose. The other half was copying, because every scroll eventually wore out. Even perfectly preserved papyrus aged slowly. Fibers weakened, edges frayed. Repeated reading left tiny marks. No manuscript lasted forever. Ancient librarians accepted this. Rather than mourning inevitable decay, they prepared for it. The answer was simple. Make another copy. Across another wing of the library sits the scriptorium, the copying room. Compared with the peaceful storage halls, this room buzzes gently with activity. Not loud activity. No shouting. Just quiet concentration. Reed pens scratch softly across papyrus. Small ceramic ink pots line the tables. Finished scrolls rest beside blank sheets waiting to receive fresh words. The atmosphere smells pleasantly of ink, papyrus, wood, and beeswax. An experienced scribe begins today's work. He unrolls the original manuscript only a short distance, just enough to copy one section. Reading aloud quietly to himself, he writes each line onto fresh papyrus, letter after letter, word after word, hour after hour. No shortcuts, no printing press, No photocopier waiting around the corner. Every single copy depends entirely upon human patience. The work is exhausting. Maintaining beautiful handwriting for an entire day requires astonishing concentration. One careless moment creates mistakes. One smudged line demands correction. One skipped sentence confuses future readers. Scribes therefore developed remarkable discipline. Some paused regularly to stretch cramped fingers. Others sharpened reed pens dozens of times throughout the day. A dull pen damaged papyrus. Sharp tools produced cleaner lines. Even handwriting benefited from proper maintenance. The chief librarian occasionally walks between the tables, not to criticize, mostly. Instead, he checks progress, reviews finished sections, answers difficult questions. Sometimes older manuscripts contain faded passages. A damaged edge hides a word. Several copies disagree. Which version is correct? These debates could occupy scholars for hours. Modern editors would recognize the experience immediately. Some problems refuse easy answers. Finished copies undergo careful comparison. One apprentice reads the original aloud. Another follows along with a new copy. Every line, every word, every symbol. Mistakes are corrected immediately. Accuracy matters. One missing number might alter a tax record. One omitted sentence could change the meaning of a philosophical argument. One misspelled name might confuse historians thousands of years later. In fact, it occasionally did. Modern archaeologists sometimes spend years untangling ancient copying errors. Some anonymous apprentice somewhere would probably feel terribly embarrassed if he knew, although perhaps also slightly impressed. Not everyone copied books. Some specialized in repairing them. Others cataloged new arrivals. Some maintained inventories. Others cleaned storage rooms. Large libraries resembled living organisms. Everyone performed different tasks. Together, they kept knowledge alive. It wasn't glamorous work. Most visitors admired famous scholars. Very few admired the fellow quietly dusting shelves. Yet remove the shelf cleaner for a few decades, and suddenly the scholars have considerably fewer books to admire. History often celebrates brilliant ideas. Less often does it celebrate the people who prevented mice from eating those ideas. Perhaps it should. As afternoon sunlight softens outside, readers begin arriving. A physician requests an older medical scroll. A government official seeks legal records. A philosopher wants several texts copied generations earlier. Each request follows a careful process. The librarian retrieves the correct scroll, checks its condition, records its temporary removal. Knowledge may be shared. It must also return safely. Borrowing privileges have apparently inspired paperwork since antiquity. Some habits never disappear. Our scroll remains safely on its shelf today. Its voyage has ended, at least for now. Perhaps decades from now another scholar will request it. Perhaps another copy will be made. Perhaps another merchant ship will carry that copy across another sea. Knowledge rarely stays still. Like the ships that transport it, ideas continue traveling long after their creators are gone. The library grows quieter as evening approaches. Pens are cleaned, ink pots sealed, cabinets closed, wax tablets stored, doors locked. The scrolls settle into darkness once again. Safe, dry, patiently waiting. Outside, the city continues its noisy business. Markets close. Fishing boats return. Children race through narrow streets. Somewhere beyond the harbor, another merchant ship prepares to leave with another carefully packed chest of papyrus. And somewhere far across the Mediterranean, another library waits, ready to welcome yet another fragile bundle of human memory. Our scroll has finally found a comfortable shelf. It would be tempting to leave it there forever. Safe, dry, surrounded by thousands of equally well-behaved neighbors. Unfortunately, history has never been particularly interested in letting anything stay comfortable for very long. Knowledge was valuable because it traveled. A medical treatise copied in Egypt might eventually help a physician hundreds of miles away. A collection of poems could find new readers in another kingdom. Government records, trade agreements, religious writings, astronomical observations, all of them moved from city to city, carried by ships that spent far more time battling the sea than admiring it. So today, we're climbing aboard another vessel. Not because the first captain did anything wrong. Quite the opposite. He successfully delivered his cargo without turning it into soggy plant fibers. That alone deserves a respectable round of very quiet historical applause. This new voyage, however, will be longer. Much longer. Weeks instead of days. Perhaps months, depending on the winds. For ancient sailors, the timetable was more of an optimistic suggestion than a promise. Nature rarely consulted human schedules. The captain stands at the edge of the dock before sunrise. He isn't looking at the ship. He's looking at the sky. Clouds, the color of the eastern horizon, the direction of the breeze, the behavior of seabirds, even the smell carried on the wind. These tiny clues matter. Modern captains have weather forecasts, satellites, and radar. Ancient captains had experience. And experience, while impressive, occasionally forgot to mention tomorrow's storm. Still, seasoned sailors became astonishingly good observers. They recognized seasonal patterns. Certain months offered calmer seas. Others invited trouble. The Mediterranean wasn't equally dangerous throughout the year. Winter frightened almost everyone. Strong winds, sudden storms, shorter daylight, higher waves. Many merchants simply refused to sail during the worst season. Trade slowed dramatically. Ships remained in harbor. Captains waited. Waiting may not sound adventurous, but it was significantly healthier than sinking. The ancient world eventually developed what historians sometimes call the sailing season. From roughly late spring through early autumn, conditions generally became more predictable. Not safe. Never entirely safe. Just less eager to destroy expensive cargo. Naturally, merchants preferred those months. Insurance companies didn't yet exist in their modern form. Good judgment had to do all the work. Loading begins once again. This time the cargo is wonderfully varied. Large clay amphorae filled with olive oil, barrels of wine, bundles of linen, sacks of grain, boxes of glassware, small crates containing carved ivory, and tucked safely among them, another carefully packed collection of papyrus scrolls. One might expect the scrolls to occupy the very center of the hold. Sometimes they did, but not always. Ancient cargo loading resembled an enormous three-dimensional puzzle. Heavy goods belonged near the bottom. Weight had to remain balanced. The ship needed stability. A captain who ignored balance soon discovered that gravity possesses an excellent memory. The scroll chests therefore occupied elevated platforms built above the heaviest cargo. Wooden beams created small raised spaces. The chests rested there, protected from puddles that inevitably collected on the floor. Beneath them, the amphorae of olive oil formed part of the foundation. An unusual arrangement, yet surprisingly practical. Olive oil was heavy, very heavy, exactly where heavy cargo belonged. The scrolls benefited from sitting safely above it. And here's where history, becomes unexpectedly amusing. Those great clay jars of olive oil, intended for cooking, lamps, and trade, accidentally became part of one of the ancient world's best document protection systems. Not because the oil itself touched the scrolls. Quite the opposite. Nobody wanted that. Imagine trying to read a scroll permanently flavored with olive oil. Future scholars would forever wonder why every page smelled faintly like dinner. Instead, the amphorae acted as shock absorbers. Their enormous weight stabilized the ship. Less violent rolling meant less movement throughout the cargo hold. Less movement meant fewer impacts against the scroll chests. Sometimes the most important protector isn't standing in front of you. Sometimes it's quietly sitting underneath. The ship departs with a favorable wind. Days begin slipping into one another. Life at sea quickly settles into routine. Morning. Adjust sails. Inspect ropes. Prepare breakfast. Check cargo. Eat. Prepare something. Sleep. Repeat. Ancient sailing was surprisingly repetitive between moments of absolute chaos. The crew develops habits. One sailor checks the lashings around a cargo every morning. Another inspects the bilge where unwanted water slowly gathers. The carpenter walks through the vessel, listening carefully. Listening, not looking. Experienced shipwrights could hear tiny changes in wooden hulls. A new creak, a sharper groan, a subtle crack. Wood speaks constantly. You simply have to understand its language. If something sounds different today than yesterday, find out why. Immediately, the scroll merchant performs his own inspections, never opening every chest. That would invite unnecessary humidity. Instead, he checks exterior bindings, wax seals, leather straps, wooden lids. Sometimes prevention means resisting the urge to fiddle with perfectly functioning equipment. Human beings have always struggled with that particular lesson. One afternoon, the wind disappears. Entirely. The sails sag. The sea becomes strangely smooth. The ship hardly moves. To modern vacationers, this might sound delightful. To ancient merchants, it was deeply frustrating. No wind meant no progress. No progress meant delayed deliveries. Delayed deliveries meant anxious customers. Ancient commerce depended heavily upon invisible moving air. Without it, everyone simply waited. The sailors occupy themselves with maintenance. Ropes receive fresh inspections. Sails are patched. Wooden buckets repaired. The captain reviews his charts, not paper maps in the modern sense, but accumulated knowledge of coastlines, landmarks, and distances passed through generations. Navigation relied as much upon memory as upon anything drawn. During the calm, the merchant decides conditions are ideal for a more thorough cargo inspection. Several assistants help him. The cedar chest opens. Cool air from inside escapes slowly. One by one, the linen bundles emerge. Still dry. Still clean. Still remarkably healthy. The leather coverings remain supple. No mildew. No strange discoloration. The voyage continues exactly as planned. Well, almost. Because nothing aboard an ancient ship ever stayed entirely predictable. As one assistant reaches for another bundle, he notices something tiny. Very tiny. A single beetle. No larger than a fingernail. Walking lazily across the outside of the chest. The reaction is immediate. Not panic. Determination. The insect disappears quickly beneath a small ceramic cup. The entire chest receives another inspection. Every corner. Every cloth. Every seam. Fortunately, only one beetle appears. Perhaps it wandered aboard accidentally with another shipment. Perhaps it had simply lost its way. Either way, it wasn't receiving permission to establish a family. Ancient sailors understood infestation. Stop one insect today. Avoid hundreds next month. Small problems rarely remain small without encouragement. The wind finally returns near sunset. Gentle at first, then stronger. The sails fill once again. The ship resumes its steady rhythm. Water curls away from the bow in silver ribbons beneath the fading light. Above, stars begin appearing one after another. Ancient navigation truly came alive after dark. Experienced captains recognized familiar constellations. They watched the steady position of northern stars. They estimated direction by observing the heavens. No electronic compass. No glowing screens. Just remarkable observation and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Imagine trusting your entire voyage to points of light scattered across the night sky. Remarkably, it worked. Not perfectly. Nothing ancient ever worked perfectly, but often enough to connect civilizations separated by hundreds of miles of open water. As the crew settles into the quiet rhythm of night watches, the scrolls rest peacefully below deck, wrapped in linen, protected by leather, sheltered inside cedar chests, raised above damp planks, lashed securely against shifting cargo, guarded by careful habits developed over generations. Every layer of protection represents another lesson someone learned the difficult way. Perhaps a ship once sank because cargo shifted. Perhaps another voyage lost valuable records to mold. Perhaps a forgotten merchant regretted placing scrolls directly upon the floor. History has an unfortunate tendency to teach through expensive mistakes. Fortunately, people remembered those lessons. And because they remembered, so eventually could we. The sea stretches endlessly into darkness. The ship glides onward beneath thousands of quiet stars. Somewhere ahead lies another harbor, another library, another group of patient conservators waiting to inspect yet another bundle of precious papyrus. For now, though, the only sounds are gentle waves against the hull, the creak of timber, the whisper of wind through the rigging, and somewhere below, a cedar chest quietly protecting humanity's memories through another peaceful night at SEA. Why now, we've survived storms. We've avoided leaking hulls. We've watched careful merchants wrap scrolls in layers of linen and leather. We've admired librarians whose greatest adventure involved discovering that a storage cabinet was perhaps 2 finger widths damper than yesterday. History, it turns out, contains many quiet heroes. But tonight, we're meeting the enemy that terrified all of them. An enemy with no army, no fleet, no king, no dramatic speeches, no battle banners. You couldn't see it marching toward your ship. You couldn't bargain with it. You couldn't stab it with a spear. And yet, it quietly destroyed more scrolls than many wars ever did. Moisture, not waves, not floods, just ordinary moisture. Tiny droplets suspended in the air. The sort of thing modern people barely notice unless their bathroom mirror fogs up. Ancient conservators noticed. Immediately. Because every breath of damp sea air carried invisible danger. Imagine waking before sunrise aboard our merchant ship. The sea is perfectly calm. The sails hang quietly. Not a single cloud darkens the eastern sky. Everything looks wonderfully peaceful. And yet, every wooden surface feels slightly damp. The rope beside the mast carries tiny beads of water. The deck glistens faintly. Even the captain's beard, assuming he has one, contains a suspicious amount of moisture. Nothing rained overnight. The sea simply breathed. Warm air during the day, cool air during the night. As temperatures changed, water condensed onto nearly everything. Modern campers know this feeling well. You leave perfectly dry equipment outside. You wake to discover it mysteriously wet. Ancient sailors experienced exactly the same surprise. Except instead of worrying about sleeping bags, they worried about priceless documents. Below deck, conditions became even more complicated. The cargo hold remained cooler than the deck. Air moved slowly. Hundreds of people, animals, barrels, sacks, and wooden beams all influenced humidity. A ship wasn't simply floating on the sea. It was carrying its own tiny climate. Sometimes, that climate behaved badly. The merchant climbs carefully into the hold, not because he expects disaster. Quite the opposite. He hopes to find absolutely nothing unusual. Conservators throughout history have shared one dream: boring inspections. The less exciting the inspection, the better yesterday probably went. He reaches the cedar chest. The exterior feels cool. Dry enough. Good. But he doesn't stop there. His fingers slide gently along the lid, around the hinges, along the seams where tiny amounts of moisture sometimes collected. Nothing alarming. Still, experience has taught him that appearances can be deceptive. He pauses. Instead of opening the chest immediately, he simply waits, listening, smelling. It sounds strange today, but ancient craftsmen trusted every sense they possessed. A faint musty smell often appeared before visible mold. A different sound when tapping would sometimes suggested hidden dampness. Observation came long before scientific instruments. Nature rarely announced problems loudly. It whispered. Successful conservators learn to whisper back. Eventually, the chest opens. Very slowly. Not because the lid is heavy, because opening it too quickly invites warm, humid air inside. The merchant allows the interior to adjust gradually. No one aboard the ship would explain this using modern physics. They simply noticed that sudden changes sometimes harm delicate materials. Centuries before scientists described humidity in percentages, practical people already understood its effects. The linen wrappings emerge one by one. Each feels almost identical. Consistency brings comfort. One bundle, however, feels ever so slightly cooler. Not wet, not damp, just cool. Most people would ignore it. This merchant doesn't. He unwraps the outer linen. The leather beneath appears healthy. No discoloration, no mildew. Yet he notices tiny salt crystals clinging to the outer surface. Perfectly ordinary. Sea air carries salt everywhere. Over time, it settles quietly onto exposed surfaces. Wood, leather, cloth, hair, beards, probably breakfast. Life aboard ship involved accepting that almost everything eventually acquired at least a hint of salt. The trick was preventing that salt from reaching the papyrus itself. Salt behaves in remarkably inconvenient ways. It attracts moisture from the surrounding air. Leave salt exposed long enough, it slowly becomes damp. Now imagine tiny salt crystals settling onto a papyrus scroll year after year. The damage wouldn't happen overnight. It would happen patiently, almost politely. Fibers gradually weakened, ink occasionally lifted. The surface lost some of its smoothness. Tiny changes, barely noticeable individually, devastating collectively. Ancient merchants therefore developed surprisingly disciplined cleaning routines, not for the scrolls themselves. That would risk damage. Instead, they cleaned everything around them. The storage chest, the leather wrapping, the linen cloth. Dust removed, salt brushed away, fresh wrappings replaced when necessary. The best way to protect fragile objects often involved caring for everything surrounding them. It's rather like keeping a roof in good condition instead of constantly mopping the floor. Ventilation became another silent guardian. Whenever weather permitted, hatches opened briefly. Fresh air drifted below deck. Not too much, not for too long, just enough to replace stale, humid air. Then everything closed again before unexpected spray found its way inside. Timing mattered. A careless sailor opening the hatch during rough seas might accidentally invite half the Mediterranean into the cargo hold. That tended to defeat the purpose. Experienced captains knew precisely when, usually during calm mornings, sometimes late afternoons, rarely at night. Night air often carried more moisture. Small decisions, enormous consequences. Interestingly, cargo itself influenced humidity. Grain absorbed moisture. Wood released it slowly. Wine barrels expanded and contracted. Fresh fruit, when carried, produced moisture as it ripened. Even human beings contributed. A ship filled with 50 sailors breathed out surprising amounts of water vapor every single day. Nobody noticed individually. Together, it mattered. Ancient ship design accidentally helped. Merchant vessels rarely sealed completely. Tiny gaps between planks allowed gradual air exchange. Modern engineers might consider that inefficient. Ancient conservators quietly appreciated it. Perfectly airtight ships may have created even greater humidity problems below deck. Sometimes imperfection becomes an unexpected advantage. History enjoys little ironies like that. One afternoon, the captain orders several cargo bundles shifted slightly. Not because they're unsafe, because balance changes throughout long voyages. Water supplies shrink. Food stores become lighter. Heavy amphorae occasionally leave the ship at intermediate ports. Weight distribution evolves constantly. During this adjustment, the scroll chest moves a short distance, only a few feet. Yet the merchant immediately inspects its new position. Is it still above the lowest point? Will water collect beneath it? Does fresh air circulate here? Could another cargo bundle fall against it during rough weather? Every question reflects experience. Someone, somewhere, had once placed valuable cargo exactly there, and regretted it deeply. Experience is history's most expensive teacher. Future generations receive the lessons free of charge. As evening approaches, the crew enjoys a rare period of calm. One sailor repairs a fishing net. Another mends a torn sandal. The ship's carpenter rubs fresh oil into wooden tools. Nearby, the merchant rewaxes several leather straps securing the scroll chest. Not because they have failed, because he refuses to wait until they do. Preventive maintenance lacks dramatic storytelling. Nobody writes epic poems celebrating a man who thoughtfully replaced a worn leather strap before it snapped. Yet that quiet decision may preserve knowledge for another century. Perhaps that's heroism of a different sort. Night settles gently across the sea. The stars emerge. The waves whisper softly against the hull. Far below deck, the scrolls remain untouched. No storms threaten them tonight. No crashing waves. No leaking seams. Only the invisible moisture drifting silently through the night air. A danger impossible to eliminate completely. Only managed. Respected. Generation after generation, ancient sailors accepted this quiet battle. They couldn't defeat the sea. They couldn't command the weather. But through careful habits, patient observation, and countless ordinary routines, they gave fragile Papyrus something precious. A chance. Sometimes history survives not because people performed extraordinary deeds, but because they repeated ordinary ones with extraordinary care. And somewhere inside that cedar chest, wrapped in linen, protected by leather, rested another collection of voices waiting patiently to outlive the people carrying them. After weeks at sea, after countless inspections, after endless mornings spent wondering whether the weather intended to cooperate, a cry finally rises from the bow. Land! No one cheers. Not immediately. Ancient sailors had a healthy respect for coastlines. Odd as that sounds, reaching land wasn't always the most dangerous part of a voyage. Open water gave a ship room to breathe. Harbors gave it rocks, sandbars, busy traffic, changing currents, pilings, other captains who were absolutely convinced everyone else should move first. Humanity has been arguing about right-of-way for a very long time. Still, land meant something wonderful. Fresh water, fresh food, dry ground, a chance to sleep without feeling the floor gently sway beneath you every few seconds. And for our merchant, it meant another opportunity to deliver precious scrolls safely. The city ahead grows larger with every passing hour. Stone walls catch the morning sunlight. Warehouses line the waterfront. Fishing boats weave between larger merchant ships like determined little insects. Smoke curls upward from bakeries beginning the day's work. Somewhere inside the city, a librarian is completely unaware that several new scrolls are quietly sailing toward his shelves. As the ship approaches the harbor entrance, activity increases immediately. Sailors shorten the great square sail. Oars appear to help guide the vessel through narrower waters. The captain studies familiar landmarks. A tall temple, a rocky outcrop, a lighthouse standing proudly near the harbor mouth. Ancient navigation relied heavily on memory. These landmarks weren't simply beautiful buildings. They were instructions. Turn here. Avoid those rocks. Keep the temple aligned with the hill until the water deepens. Every experienced captain carried an invisible map inside his head, one built through years of careful observation. Mistakes rarely lasted long enough to become habits. The harbor itself is wonderfully alive. Ships from every direction crowd the docks. Some arrive from Egypt carrying grain, others from Cyprus with copper, some from islands rich in timber, others from distant coasts, bringing purple dye, spices, glass, pottery, or fine cloth. Different languages drift across the water. Different clothing, different customs, different coins changing hands. Yet everyone understands one universal language remarkably well: trade. Our merchant vessel finally eases alongside a sturdy stone quay. Thick ropes fly through the air. Dock workers catch them skillfully. Heavy wooden bollards receive the lines. The ship settles gently against worn stone blocks, polished smooth by generations of arrivals. Only now does the captain smile. Not broadly. Experienced captains rarely wasted dramatic celebrations. But enough. The voyage succeeded. Again. Soon officials arrived. Not soldiers. Not tax collectors. Although, occasionally the distinction became somewhat blurry. Harbor administrators carried wax tablets and writing tools. Every arriving cargo required documentation. What goods had arrived? Who owned them? Where had they originated? Were import duties owed? Ancient governments appreciated paperwork almost as enthusiastically as modern ones. The merchant presents his cargo inventory. One scroll lists every chest aboard. Another records previous inspections. Wax seals remain largely intact. The officials compare documents patiently. Everything matches. A pleasant surprise for everyone involved. Disagreements meant delays. Delays meant unhappy merchants. And unhappy merchants possessed a remarkable talent for complaining loudly enough that everyone nearby became equally unhappy. At last, the cedar chest containing our scrolls reaches the dock. Unlike heavy amphory that requires strength above all else, document chests require balance. Two experienced handlers lift together. A third walks behind, not carrying weight, watching. If one man stumbles, the third immediately helps steady the load. Simple teamwork. Remarkably effective. The chest travels through narrow streets toward a warehouse reserved for valuable goods. The city slowly wakes around it. Market stalls open. Bread emerges warm from ovens. Children chase one another through dusty alleys. Blacksmiths begin hammering. Potters arrange freshly fired vessels. Nobody pays much attention to the quiet wooden chest passing through the crowd. Inside, however, rest dozens of voices from distant lands. Recipes, poems, medical advice, tax records, letters, religious hymns, mathematical calculations, all wrapped neatly in linen. History often hides inside very ordinary boxes. The warehouse differs from those storing grain or wine. The air feels cooler. Windows remain narrow. Thick walls soften changes in temperature. The floor stands slightly above street level. An intentional design. Rainwater occasionally flooded busy ports. Raised floors reduced unpleasant surprises. The supervisor unlocks the storage room. His first task isn't opening the chest. It's allowing it to rest. That might seem strange. After all, the scrolls have already traveled hundreds of miles. Surely another few minutes hardly matter. Exactly. Those few minutes allow the chest to adjust gradually from the cool air below deck to the warmer conditions ashore. Rapid changes in temperature sometimes encourage condensation. Again, no one described this scientifically. They simply noticed patterns. Patient handling produced healthier scrolls. Rushing produced headaches. History repeatedly rewards patience. When the inspection finally begins, everything proceeds almost ceremonially. The wax seal breaks. The lid rises. The familiar scent of cedar escapes. One linen bundle emerges. Then another. Each receives careful examination. Hands remain clean. The table surface has already been wiped free of dust. Nothing sharp lies nearby. No ink pots waiting to spill accidentally. A single careless splash could undo months of successful preservation. Even apprentices understand the rules. No food near the manuscripts. No hurried movements. No unnecessary touching. Some lessons remain timeless. Modern archives enforce remarkably similar habits. One elderly librarian enters quietly. His hair has turned completely gray. His robe shows careful repairs at the elbows. He walks slowly, not because age has defeated him, because people who spend decades around fragile manuscripts naturally become gentle. He lifts one scroll, studies the handwriting, smiles faintly. He recognizes the scribe, not personally. The man may have lived hundreds of miles away, but experienced librarians often recognize distinctive handwriting the way modern readers recognize familiar authors. Every scribe possessed tiny habits, the angle of certain letters, the spacing between lines, the thickness of strokes. Handwriting became a signature, without signing anything at all. The librarian nods approvingly. This one was copied well. A simple sentence. High praise. Some copies arrived filled with mistakes. Others displayed uneven ink. Occasionally an exhausted scribe skipped an entire line. Human beings have always been wonderfully imperfect. Fortunately, other human beings spent equal effort correcting those imperfections. Not every scroll remains here. This harbor serves as another crossroads. Some manuscripts continue farther west. Others travel north. A few remain in local collections. Knowledge moves much like merchants themselves, rarely standing still. A physician purchases copies of medical writings. A temple requests religious texts. A wealthy official commissions duplicate legal records for his estate. Another merchant prepares several scrolls for yet another sea voyage. Our little chest gradually empties. One scroll leaves for a nearby library. Another enters private hands. A third joins government archives. The knowledge once gathered together aboard one ship now spreads across an entire region. Ideas travel faster when divided. Ironically, separating the scrolls helps preserve them. If one city suffers fire, another copy may survive elsewhere. Ancient librarians couldn't eliminate disaster. They could reduce its consequences. Multiple copies became history's earliest insurance policy. As afternoon sunlight pours across the harbor, another merchant ship begins loading nearby. Fresh cedar chests appear. Fresh linen wrappings. Fresh wax seals. The cycle begins again. Some of today's carefully inspected scrolls will soon leave this city. Another captain will check the weather. Another crew will tighten ropes. Another storm may arrive without invitation. The sea never rests. Neither does knowledge. It continues moving from harbor to harbor, shelf to shelf, hand to hand, century to century, quietly, patiently, almost stubbornly. Looking back from our own time, it's astonishing that so many ancient texts survived it all. Given the storms, the humidity, the insects, the fires, the accidents, the wars, one might expect almost everything to have vanished. Instead, enough endured, enough careful sailors, enough patient librarians, enough anonymous craftsmen, enough merchants who understood that a simple cedar chest could carry something far heavier than its weight suggested. Because inside those humble containers, wrapped in leather and linen, traveling slowly across unpredictable seas, wasn't merely papyrus. It was memory. And memory, fragile though it seemed, proved remarkably determined to survive. To be why this point in our journey, you might be starting to think the ancient world had developed a nearly foolproof system. Linen, leather, cedar chests, wax seals, raised platforms, patient merchants, meticulous librarians, experienced captains, careful conservators. Honestly, they had thought of almost everything. Almost. Unfortunately, history possesses a remarkable ability to invent entirely new problems. Sometimes the sea ignored every careful precaution. Sometimes the weather arrived with all the subtlety of an angry bull wandering into a pottery market. Sometimes a tiny spark landed exactly where it shouldn't. Sometimes politics marched into places where scrolls had been peacefully resting for generations. No amount of excellent organization can completely prevent bad luck. The ancients understood this better than most. They didn't expect perfection. They expected trouble. The real measure of success wasn't avoiding every disaster. It was surviving enough of them. Our story begins aboard another merchant vessel, not because our previous ship failed. It completed its voyage safely, but hundreds of similar ships cross the Mediterranean every year. Each carried different cargo, different crews, different fortunes. This vessel sails beneath a bright summer sky. The wind is steady, the sea calm. The captain is in an unusually cheerful mood. which, in hindsight, should probably have made everyone slightly suspicious. History often waits until people become comfortable. Cargo fills the hold. Wine, grain, fine cloth, several amphorae of honey, a shipment of carved wooden furniture, and, naturally, 3 cedar chests filled with carefully wrapped papyrus scrolls. One belongs to a wealthy merchant. Another carries temple records. The third contains copies of philosophical works commissioned by a distant library. Months of labor rest quietly inside. Thousands upon thousands of carefully written lines, each copied by hand. Every mistake corrected patiently. Every sheet prepared with care. An extraordinary amount of human effort fits inside 3 ordinary-looking boxes. The first days pass peacefully. The crew settles into familiar routines. Morning inspections, simple meals, minor repairs, watching the horizon, checking the wind, complaining about the food. Some traditions apparently transcend every century. The ship follows a well-known route. Other vessels appear occasionally. Fishing boats wave from nearby islands. Everything feels reassuringly ordinary. Then, just after sunset on the 5th evening, the wind changes. Not dramatically. Simply enough to make the captain pause. He studies the western sky. Dark clouds gather low over the water. No lightning. Not yet. But experienced sailors know storms often announce themselves quietly. Orders spread across the deck. Reef the sail. Secure loose cargo. Double-check the lashings. Close unnecessary hatches. Nobody runs. Nobody panics. Every sailor knows exactly what to do. Preparation begins long before the first raindrop falls. Below deck, the merchant joins several crewmen. They inspect the cedar chests. Leather straps remain tight. Wooden braces still hold everything firmly against the support beams. Good. One sailor wedges additional blocks beneath a nearby barrel. Another tightens ropes securing a stack of amphorae. Heavy cargo has an unfortunate tendency to become considerably more adventurous during storms. The merchant runs his hand across one chest. Not because touching would magically improve protection. Because familiar objects sometimes reveal unfamiliar problems. A loose hinge, a tiny crack, a worn strap. Nothing escapes careful attention. Fortunately, everything appears ready. Outside, the first gust arrives. The sail snaps loudly. The ship heels sharply. Rain begins almost immediately. Not gentle rain. Heavy rain driven sideways by strengthening winds. Within minutes, the deck disappears beneath rushing water. Crew members cling to ropes polished smooth by generations of anxious hands. The sea rises. Not gradually. Almost impatiently. Wave after wave strikes the hull. The vessel climbs steep walls of water before plunging into deep valleys between them. Timbers groan. Masts creak. Rigging whistles through the darkness. Every sound reminds the crew that wood, however strong, remains only wood. Then disaster nearly arrives. A tremendous crash echoes below deck. One enormous amphora has broken free. The heavy clay vessel rolls violently across the cargo hold. It strikes another jar. That one tips dangerously. Several sailors scramble after it. Imagine chasing a rolling barrel across the floor of a building experiencing an earthquake. Now make the floor wet and dark. That begins to describe the situation. The first amphora finally wedges against a timber support. Disaster narrowly avoided. Had it continued, it might have smashed directly into the cedar chests. Months of careful preparation could have ended in seconds. Instead, One quick-thinking sailor had shoved a spare beam beneath its path. Not heroic in the dramatic sense. No triumphant music played. No spectators applauded. He simply noticed danger and acted. History quietly depends upon people like that. Water continues seeping through tiny seams in the hull. Not enough to sink the ship. Not yet, but enough to keep the crew busy. Buckets appear everywhere. Men bail continuously, hour after hour. The merchant notices water beginning to pool beneath nearby cargo. Immediately, several sailors lift the cedar chests onto even higher supports. Only a few extra inches. Sometimes, a few inches decide whether history survives. The work is exhausting. The ship pitches violently. Every movement requires balance. One misplaced step sends a sailor sprawling across the wet deck. Still, no one complains. Not because ancient sailors possess supernatural patience, because they understood priorities. You complain after surviving, not during. As midnight approaches, another danger appears. Not from the sea, from inside the ship. A lantern swings wildly with each violent roll. Its flame flickers dangerously close to hanging rope. The ship's carpenter notices first. Without hesitation, he shields the lantern. Another sailor extinguishes it completely. Darkness fills the cargo hold. Instantly, some might think extinguishing the only light seems reckless. Quite the opposite. Fire terrified ancient sailors more than almost anything. A wooden ship carried tar, pitch, dry rope, wooden beams, linen sails, oil lamps, everything needed for a spectacular catastrophe. A small flame below deck could spread faster than any crew could respond. Better temporary darkness than permanent disaster. The merchant now works entirely by touch, feeling the straps, the chest, the supports beneath. His fingers become his eyes. Somewhere above, thunder rolls across the sea. The storm continues, but at least, the ship isn't burning. Sometimes success simply means reducing the number of simultaneous emergencies. Toward dawn, the wind finally weakens. Not all at once, little by little. The waves remain large, but their rhythm softens. Rain becomes lighter. Clouds begin breaking apart. Gray morning light slowly replaces the darkness. The exhausted crew emerges onto the deck. Faces soaked, clothes heavy with salt water, hands raw from rope and buckets. No one looks particularly heroic. Mostly, they look tired, which is often what real survival looks like. Below deck, the merchant opens the first cedar chest. Very carefully. Inside, the linen remains dry, the leather wrapping untouched, the papyrus unharmed. He closes his eyes for a moment, not dramatically, just quietly grateful. Every precaution had mattered. The raised platforms, the leather coverings, the waxed linen, the tight lashings, the extra wooden braces, the quick-thinking sailor who stopped the rolling amphora, the carpenter who extinguished the lantern. None of those actions seemed especially remarkable by themselves. Together, they saved years of human knowledge. The captain surveys the battered ship. One sail requires repair. Several ropes must be replaced. A section of railing has disappeared entirely. The cook's favorite pot is nowhere to be found. The sea has apparently claimed it as payment. The sailor shrugged. It could have been much worse. Ancient crews judged storms differently than we often do today. A damaged ship could be repaired. Lost cargo might eventually be replaced. But lives and unique manuscripts, those demanded every possible effort. As the sun climbs above the horizon, the merchant secures the cedar chests once more. The voyage continues, slower now, more cautiously. Every sailor aboard understands that another storm may still lie ahead. The Mediterranean rarely promises otherwise. Yet the scrolls remain safe, not because fate guaranteed their survival, but because countless ordinary people prepared carefully for extraordinary problems. And in the quiet aftermath of the storm, with the sea finally beginning to forgive them, the greatest treasure aboard the ship wasn't gold, it wasn't silver, it wasn't precious gemstones. It was a collection of fragile papyrus scrolls, still perfectly dry, waiting patiently to tell their stories for generations yet to come. Why now? Our little collection of papyrus scrolls has traveled farther than many people in the ancient world ever did. From the marshes of the Nile to the workshop of the papyrus maker, from the careful desk of a patient scribe to a merchant's cedar chest, across unpredictable seas, through storms, past customs officials, into warehouses, across library shelves, back onto ships, and finally, into the hands of scholars waiting eagerly for fresh knowledge. For something so fragile, papyrus certainly had an adventurous life. Ironically, the people who created many of these scrolls often traveled very little. The scrolls did the traveling for them. Ideas proved much better sailors than humans. The city has only just awakened. Morning sunlight slips between tall stone buildings. Market stalls remain closed. Only bakers and fishermen have begun their day's work. Inside the library, however, activity has already started. Libraries rarely enjoyed sleeping late. One apprentice sweeps yesterday's dust from the stone floor. Another checks every shutter, making sure the night's damp air has not lingered too long. A senior librarian unlocks a cedar cabinet with a small bronze key. The hinges complain softly. Wood, after all, likes reminding everyone that it has been carrying heavy shelves for decades. Inside rests our familiar scroll, still wrapped in linen, still protected by leather, still carrying words that have already outlived several generations of readers. Not bad for something made from a swampland. This morning, the scroll has an appointment. Not the sort involving calendars and polite reminders. Ancient libraries had neither. Instead, a scholar has requested it. His work concerns medicine. He has spent years comparing treatments recorded in different cities. Some physicians recommend herbs. Others prefer carefully measured diets. Some insist on rest. Others recommend exercise. A few offer treatments that make modern readers quietly grateful for modern medicine. History contains many fascinating ideas. Not all of them should be repeated. The librarian carries the scroll to a reading room. No one rushes. No one tosses it onto a table. Knowledge travels slowly inside good libraries. The scholar bows respectfully, not to the librarian, to the manuscript. That gesture might seem unusual today, yet it reflects something important. The scroll isn't sacred because of its materials. Papyrus isn't rare. Leather isn't magical. It can always be mixed again. What matters is the thought preserved inside. Respect belongs to the ideas. The scholar settles onto a simple wooden chair. Nearby rests a small writing table. Fresh sheets of papyrus await. A sharpened reed pen lies beside a ceramic ink pot. He gently unties the linen cord. The scroll opens with its familiar whisper. Quiet sound, almost like someone taking a careful breath. The scholar begins reading, not silently. Ancient readers often read aloud or in a soft murmur. The room soon fills with gentle voices, not conversations. Several scholars each reading different manuscripts quietly to themselves. A strange chorus of knowledge. Some discuss mathematics, others poetry. One elderly man appears entirely absorbed in a document about irrigation canals. Every subject finds its reader. The medical scholar pauses frequently. He copies selected passages, not the entire scroll, only sections relevant to his work. Every copied sentence becomes another branch growing from the same tree of knowledge. Ideas spread one careful line at a time. Across the room, another scribe prepares something even more ambitious. He has been instructed to create a complete duplicate. The original scroll has survived many decades already. Wise librarians know it will not last forever. Even excellent care cannot stop time. So, another copy begins. The original rests on a wooden stand. Fresh papyrus lies beside it. The scribe dips his reed pen. One line, then another. Slowly, patiently. His handwriting closely resembles the original. Not by accident. Professional scribes often train for years before copying important texts. Beautiful handwriting impressed people. Accurate handwriting preserved civilizations. The second mattered rather more. Occasionally the chief librarian walks past. He glances briefly at the new copy, not searching for artistic beauty, searching for consistency, spacing, margins, ink quality. A careless copy today becomes tomorrow's historical mystery. Somewhere in the future, another scholar might wonder why one version contains an extra sentence. The answer could simply be, an apprentice sneezed. History is wonderfully human that way. While the copying continues, visitors arrive from distant cities. One merchant seeks trade records. A temple official requests religious hymns. A government representative needs old tax documents. Libraries never existed in isolation. They formed part of an enormous network stretching across the ancient world. Ships carried scrolls. Merchants financed copies. Kings sponsored collections. Priests preserved rituals. Scholars exchanged ideas. Even ordinary craftsmen contributed through careful work. Knowledge survived because countless professions cooperated without necessarily realizing it. The sailor protecting a cedar. Chest during a storm would probably never meet the philosopher who later read its contents. Yet both depended upon each other. History enjoys invisible partnerships. Outside the library, life continues at its usual pace. Caravans arrive through the city gates. Fishing boats unload their catch. Potters shape fresh clay. Children chase one another through narrow streets. Few of them realize that behind thick stone walls, people are quietly preserving ideas that may still be read 2,000 years later. History often happens quietly. We tend to remember the loud moments, battles, coronations, revolutions. Yet those dramatic events survive largely because someone carefully copied them onto papyrus. Then someone else wrapped that papyrus in linen. Then another person placed it inside a cedar chest. Then a sailor kept the chest dry during a storm. Then a librarian repaired a torn edge. Then another scribe copied it again. One famous king might receive an entire chapter in history books. The anonymous people who made that chapter possible usually receive a single sentence. Sometimes, not even that. As afternoon light softens, the scholar finishes his work. He gently rolls the manuscript closed. The linen cord returns to its familiar place. He hands the scroll back with both hands. The librarian inspects it briefly. No new damage. No loose fibers. No ink smudges. Excellent. The manuscript returns to its cabinet. Its day's work complete. Nearby, however, the copy continues. The younger scribe still writes steadily. His wrist aches. His fingers carry tiny black stains from carbon ink. He barely notices. Another page. Another paragraph. Another careful sentence. By sunset, he has copied only a fraction of the original. No one complains. Everyone expected this. Some manuscripts required weeks, others months. Speed was never the goal. Accuracy was. There are few shortcuts when preserving civilization. As evening approaches, shutters close one by one. The reading room grows quieter. Ink pots receive their lids. Reed pens are washed. Wax tablets stack neatly. The librarian performs one final walk through the storage rooms. He checks every cabinet, every shelf, every window, every lock. Routine. Always routine. Tomorrow, the same inspection will happen again. And the day after. And the day after that. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson our scroll has taught us. Its survival never depended upon one spectacular rescue. It depended upon thousands of ordinary mornings, thousands of careful habits, thousands of small decisions made correctly. History often celebrates dramatic heroes. Yet the greatest guardian of knowledge may simply have been consistency, the willingness to do the right thing, every single day, even when nobody was watching. The library doors close. Outside, the city settles into evening. Inside, our scroll rests once more in darkness, waiting patiently, not for tomorrow, not even for next year, but perhaps for another century, because somewhere in the future, another curious reader will untie the same linen cord, hear the same quiet whisper of ancient papyrus, and discover that a humble plant from the banks of the Nile, protected by sailors, merchants, scribes, and librarians, has carried its voice safely across thousands of years. Well, here we are. Our little papyrus scroll has traveled farther than almost anyone who first touched it could ever have imagined. It began life as a tall green reed swaying gently beside the Nile. It passed through the hands of harvesters, papyrus makers, scribes, merchants, dock workers, sailors, captains, customs officials, librarians, conservators, scholars, copyists, and countless anonymous people whose names disappeared long ago. Yet somehow, the words survived. That's really the remarkable part. Not that ancient people built ships. Many civilizations built ships. Not that they invented libraries. Many cultures valued learning. The astonishing achievement is that they managed to keep extraordinarily fragile documents alive while carrying them across one of the busiest seas on Earth. 4 centuries. Again, and again, and again. Time, however, never stops moving. The centuries pass quietly. Empires rise. Empires collapse. New rulers arrive speaking different languages. Old trade routes shift. Ports that once bustled with activity become strangely silent. Others grow larger than anyone had expected. The Mediterranean keeps doing what it has always done, rolling gently one day, roaring furiously the next. The ships change slowly. Builders improve hull designs. Rigging becomes stronger. Navigation grows more sophisticated. But one thing remains stubbornly familiar. Every captain carrying manuscripts still worries about water. Some problems refuse to become old-fashioned. Eventually, another writing material begins spreading across the ancient world. Parchment. Unlike papyrus, parchment comes from carefully prepared animal skins. It costs more, requires different skills, takes longer to produce. Yet it possesses one enormous advantage. It survives moisture rather better than papyrus. Not perfectly. Nothing ancient enjoyed becoming wet, but parchment bends where papyrus sometimes breaks. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, libraries begin adding more parchment manuscripts to their collections. The old papyrus scrolls remain. No one throws them away. Knowledge is still knowledge, but change has begun. History rarely replaces old ideas overnight. It simply introduces new ones until, one day, people suddenly realize the world looks different. Another transformation quietly arrives. The codex. Instead of one long scroll, individual pages are stacked together and sewn along one edge. In other words, something beginning to resemble the modern book. Imagine explaining this innovation to an elderly librarian who has spent 50 years carefully organizing scrolls. So, instead of rolling the document, we're going to fold hundreds of sheets, stack them, sew them together, and then put covers around them. He might stare for a very long moment, then quietly ask, why would anyone willingly create more corners to damage? Every generation finds the next generation's technology slightly confusing. Some traditions never change. Still, the codex proves wonderfully practical. Finding one passage no longer requires unrolling several feet of papyrus. Readers simply turn pages. Storage changes. Libraries adapt. Shelves evolve. Yet none of these improvements erase the importance of the scrolls that came before. Without them, there would have been nothing to copy. Not every manuscript survives these centuries. That is one of history's quiet sadnesses. Some libraries suffer fires. Others experience floods. Some cities decline economically. Buildings collapse. Roofs leak. Wars interrupt ordinary life. Political upheaval scatters collections. Neglect accomplishes what armies sometimes cannot. A forgotten storeroom can prove almost as dangerous as a battlefield. Then there are the insects, still patiently nibbling. The mold, still waiting for damp corners. The mice, still entirely unconcerned with literary history. Ancient librarians spent generations fighting these enemies. Sometimes they won. Sometimes time simply won instead. It would be comforting to imagine that every beautiful manuscript reached the modern world safely. It didn't. Far from it. Millions of words vanished forever. Countless poems, scientific observations, personal letters, philosophical arguments, local histories, plays, medical recipes, simple shopping lists, gone. Not because people failed to care, but because preserving fragile plant fibers for thousands of years borders on the miraculous. Every surviving scroll, therefore, represents something extraordinary. Not perfection. Survival. Occasionally, chance lends a helping hand. A document becomes buried beneath dry desert sand. The climate protects it. Another remains sealed inside a forgotten tomb. Someone discovers it centuries later. A ruined town preserves hundreds of manuscripts beneath collapsed buildings. Accidents sometimes become archives. History enjoys strange ironies. Meanwhile, elsewhere, dedicated copyists continue quietly transferring older papyrus texts onto newer parchment, one careful line at a time. They aren't trying to become famous. They're trying to ensure tomorrow still remembers yesterday. Those copyists become bridges between worlds. Without them, many ancient authors would exist only as names. Think back to our very first voyage. Remember the cedar chest, the linen wrappings, the leather covers, the raised platform above the damp floor. the sailor who checked the lashings one more time before the storm, the merchant who opened the chest only when absolutely necessary, the librarian who inspected every edge, the conservator patiently repairing tiny tears. None of them knew us. None imagined people living thousands of years in the future. They weren't preserving history for modern museums. They were simply doing today's work properly. Perhaps that's the most beautiful part of the entire story. History is rarely saved by people announcing, "I shall preserve this for the next 3 millennia." Instead, someone quietly says, "This chest needs another leather strap," or "That scroll should dry one more day," or "Let's make another copy before this one wears out." Civilizations often survive through ordinary competence, not spectacular genius. Today, archaeologists gently unroll surviving papyrus fragments beneath carefully controlled lighting. Conservators wear gloves. Special humidity chambers help fragile fibers relax without breaking. High-resolution cameras record every detail. Digital archives allow scholars across the world to study texts without repeatedly handling the originals. Technology has changed dramatically. The goal has not. Protect the words. Every modern conservator shares something with those ancient librarians. Patience, respect, an understanding that fragile things deserve gentle hands. The tools changed. The responsibility remained. And somewhere, resting safely behind museum glass, perhaps only a small fragment remains. A few faded lines. Several missing corners. Tiny holes where insects once enjoyed an unexpected meal. To an ordinary visitor, it may appear disappointingly incomplete. Just an old piece of brown plant fiber. Easy to overlook. Yet hidden inside that fragment lies an astonishing journey. It crossed rivers. It crossed seas. It survived storms. It escaped damp cargo holds. It avoided careless fires. It outlived kingdoms. It witnessed languages changing around it. It passed through hundreds of hands, each person adding one more small act of protection, one more quiet kindness, one more ordinary day helping extraordinary knowledge endure. So, as our voyage finally comes to an end, let's give a little thought to the anonymous people history almost forgot. The sailor tightening one last rope before dark. The dockworker lifting a cedar chest with unusual care. The merchant refusing to hurry an inspection. The apprentice replacing a faded label. The conservator repairing a tear almost too small to notice. The librarian opening windows at precisely the right moment to keep humidity under control. None became emperors. None conquered continents. None built pyramids. Yet without them, much of what we know about the ancient world might simply have disappeared into the sea. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson waiting beneath tonight's story. The greatest victories are not always loud. Sometimes they arrive wrapped in linen, tucked inside a cedar chest, carried across gentle waves, protected by ordinary people who never expected anyone to remember them. Fortunately for us, their work remembered itself. Their patience became our history. Their careful hands carried voices across thousands of years. And tonight, those voices carried us gently to the end of another sleepy journey through the past. So thank you for sailing with me through ancient harbors, stormy seas, quiet libraries, and a remarkable world of papyrus scrolls. Now let the waves grow calm once more. Let the cedar chests remain tightly closed. Let the old library settle into peaceful silence. And let those ancient scrolls, finally, get a well-earned night's rest.